Me to BeeCon. Last time I was here, I think it was 2016, so it's great to be here again. For those who know me, my name's Garland. I'm a third-year PhD student in Scott McCarver's lab. Um, and so today I basically want to talk about so a paper that came out just last month. I'm really excited to share this project for everyone, partly because it came from an undergraduate research project I did in 2016, and two, it's been just published. So it's been a long journey, and I do want to quickly acknowledge Nick and Kelly just for helping me out with the data analysis and theory, and for Scott, my PI, who provided me with an excellent data set that combines two interesting topics that I'll talk about in just a sec. So here's a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about. So first, I'm going to talk about this conceptual framework that Kelly had. It was a really cool idea of combining this theoretical framework that Mark Haddad and Carolyn Tucker proposed in 2017 about how communities can create non-random sets of how there are non-random subsets of ecological communities. And we're going to apply that using urbanization. And then Scott had this idea of using his PhD work here done at York University, using these designed bee hotels or trap nests to test out this framework. And finally, I'm going to apply this framework using to solitary cavity nesting bees and wasps and their traits as well. So since this is a very bee-centric conference, I'm only going to go brief on the first route and then spend a bit more time on the last two. Okay, so I want to start a little broad about talking about urbanization as an environmental filter. Here, I'm talking urbanization as a process where if you go from rural to urban habitats, you get more habitat loss, where impervious surfaces replace natural habitats for species and negatively affects them, their survival and reproduction. So the idea is that if urbanization was an environmental filter, and it negatively impacts species, then what will result is a filter where you would have ecological communities with phenotypically similar species. So I'm going to take that idea and apply it to this theoretical framework from Mark Haddad and Carolyn Tucker. And so basically the idea is you have three criterion that you need to meet in order to see if urbanization does result in this clustering of communities. So the first one, as I said before, you should be able to see these non-random subset communities somewhere across your sampled region. But you also need to make sure that this clustering that you see here, so the black dots in the first image, that this clustering is not due to other ecological processes that could result in clustering. So some examples would be herbivory or predation, for example. So in this case, these clusterings, the black dots in that second image that I just showed up, should be located in these highly urbanized environments with high impervious surface cover. Finally, in order for traits to play a role in urbanization, where species that are well adapted to these urban environments, in this case, they have these optimal environments with their traits. Since they're well adapted, they should be able to survive and reproduce better than those that live in suboptimal environments. In this case, they become better competitors, and therefore the result you get is clustering. So in this case, you do need to show that at least some particular traits are linked to the outcome of clustering that I show in the second figure. So you need to meet all three to as a rigorous framework to see if urbanization does filter out species. And this can be applied to plants, spiders. Mark has done some work on that. And today we're going to talk about applying this to another species that hasn't been studied in terms of filtering with this framework, is the solitary cavity nesting bees. So this is Scott's PhD work that he did from 2011 to 2013. You can see in the top right image, the image of the bee hotels or the trap nests that he used. The nice thing about this as a model system, he can easily employ this across the entire landscape gradient that could make up as an urbanization gradient. So he did about 200 of these design trap nests. There's a total of 51 species. Of course, this is a bee conference, so I'm going to focus a bit more on bees, but he also collect wasps as well. There's also 4 other green space types that he managed to collect in this pretty extensive work. So green roofs, home garden, parks, and community gardens. Another interesting part is that with these trap nests, because the female can lay in a single tube and basically create these brood cells, it allows us to actually quantify species abundance and community abundance to apply to this framework. And finally, Scott had this really cool idea of combining 7 different traits that are congruent across both the bees and wasps, the solitary cavity nesting kind. And so we had a list of 7. So we have the nesting material preference, the diet, body size, exotic status, the number of nesting material types. So for example, some bees can collect both pebbles and leaves as their nesting materials, their specialization and trophic ranks as well. And so the major question we asked in this paper was, does environmental filtering and biourbanization occur in this particular group of bees and wasps, solitary cavity nesting species, in terms of a trait-based approach? So I'm going to repeat the hypotheses we have. We have 3 of them. Each of them correspond to each of that criteria I just showed you in that previous slide. For the first hypothesis, we hypothesized that yes, significantly clustered communities can occur. In the second hypothesis, the clustering should be associated with urbanization. And finally, traits are non-randomly related to urbanization. Okay, so I'm gonna mainly go over the main highlights of some of our findings. I'm just gonna be to show the main results and then talk about a bit about the interpretations. So in the x-axis, you'll see that we quantified trait diversity here on the x-axis, where values below 0 indicate clustering. Those in the gray dots represents communities that are neither significantly clustered nor over dispersed. By over dispersion, I mean that these are communities that have ecologically dissimilar in terms of their traits. Okay, so we also have on the y-axis public parks, home gardens, green roofs, and community gardens as well. So you can see that only about 127 communities don't really meet this criterion, suggesting that we failed the first criterion for this framework. But Scott, Kelly, Nick, and I found that 6 out of the 10 that are significantly clustered were found on green roofs. So that was an interesting result, and we speculate that the rooftop is a very different urban environment compared to the public parks, the home gardens, and the community gardens, possibly because of their unique properties, such as being isolated from ground level and being exposed more to sun, wind, and drought. So for the second criterion, we create a scatter plot. On the x-axis is the impervious surface, percent impervious surface, at a 200-meter buffer scale around each of the trap nests. So values closer to 100 indicate highly urbanized environments. And then on the y-axis is the trait diversity metric that we use, where values lower than 0 indicate clustering. So you can see here, it's pretty obvious that you have a lot of spread. And one thing to note is that a lot of the significantly clustered communities are all along the range of this gradient that we see here. Suggesting that we also failed the second criterion. And Scott and I talked as a group, we talked about this, and we think maybe microsite conditions are probably likely explain more of this variation. For example, microsite conditions such as the metal tire arm, metal armchairs, any nesting, novel nesting opportunities that are much finer scale than a landscape variable that we have here. We also applied this to 500-meter scale as well, since the bees and wasps are central foragers, and we found similar results as well at that spatial scale. Okay, finally, for the third criterion, I know this is a lot to see in the image, but I do have like 2 take-home messages from here. Is that the first one for this criterion, that traits should be non-randomly related to urbanization, is that we do have some natural history information that is interesting as patterns. For example, cellophane bees, those that secrete their own nesting materials, tend to be more overrepresented in urban environments, whereas megachile, the leafcutter bees, since they do collect a lot of leaves, tend to be more overrepresented in green habitats. And we do see that wasps also have some patterns seen for prey preference as well. I'm not we're not entirely sure why this was the case, but we do think that maybe the landscape variable is too coarse and that this leads to no common responses seen for individual traits that allow us to detect a significant relationship. So I'm gonna go over just a quick summary of what I found. I didn't find much in terms of this, how this framework is. Basically, the solitary cavity nesting communities are not really affected by urbanization. So first, we only found significant clustering only 10 out of the 136 samples for this first criterion. On the second criterion, we didn't find any relationship between the clustering urbanization. And then we found that traits are randomly related to urbanization. So we didn't really find either of the three criterion that match, suggesting that for these fine scale patchwork of habitats in the city of Toronto, this particular community is pretty robust to urbanization. Okay, so what I've talked about is the framework Kadalt and Tucker in 2017 provides a robust framework to see if urbanization acts as an environmental filter for different taxonomic groups. Like I said before, it's been done on plants, spiders as well. And now we've applied this to solitary cavity nesting bees and wasps. It'd be really interesting to see if this applies to other taxonomic groups using the same three criterion framework. And we especially hope to see it could be applied to ground nesting bees as well, which are probably more sensitive to these urbanization gradients. We used Scott's trap nest data set, a model system, and we did find many relevant traits across the urbanization gradient, but we didn't find any that were significantly related. And like I said before, it seems that this trait diversity is pretty robust to the urbanization gradient, at least seen in the city of Toronto. Okay, so finally want to acknowledge a lot of people who helped out with this project throughout the years. I do want to thank the BeeCon organizers for helping create this conference and just give me a chance to share the results. Right. Is there time for questions? Okay. Yep. Never mind.
I'm wondering that, like, if the hypothesis does it depend on like kind of capturing a certain amount of like? Does it operate at any scale? Essentially, I guess the question is, what's the impact of like scale, the resolution, spatial resolution of the study on testing that hypothesis?
So just generally speaking, right?
Yeah.
That could be flexible. I don't think. Oh yeah, sorry. So Amron asked a really interesting question. He thought the framework was interesting, and he thought that if there are any specific spatial scales that should be applied to test this framework. I don't think Mark actually mentioned in the paper any specific scales. So in this case, we probably chose scales that are appropriate to the organism that we studied, if that makes sense. Yeah, for plants, it would be a different scale as well. Mark did it with a meta-analysis for invasive plants. And I think he used a typical 1 meter squared.
But that wasn't part of like his paper.
No, he took the framework, set it out and applied to the plants. And then we took the paper and applied it to bees. Got it.
There's a question online asking how do the trap nests work?
Scott's the expert in this, but I'll give a brief summary. So basically what Scott did was he set it out in May and he placed it in the location. And then over time, the females would colonize the trap nest, depending if it bees and wasps. And he would basically take the bee hotel at the end of October, if that answers your question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.